Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I was hired on the dark web to clean up after alien sightings. The things we're covering up are still out there. I didn't expect to find myself deep in the weirdest corners of the internet. Honestly, whoever does? But there I was, bored out of my mind and lurking on forums I shouldn't have been in. It started harmlessly enough. I was looking for gigs, freelance work, odd jobs, you name it. My usual sources had dried up and I was desperate. That's when I stumbled across a post that was different. The thread title was simple. Need discreet cleanup crew. $10,000 for one night's work. I know, it sounds ridiculous. And I'm not stupid, okay? I've heard all the horror stories about the dark web, the illegal stuff, the people who go missing. But I'm not talking about the dark web, not yet anyway. This was just a random, low-traffic site where people posted questionable jobs for cash. The kind of place where you might find someone offering to pay $200 to take care of a cheating spouse's car or some other shady favor. But $10,000? I was curious. I clicked in, fully expecting it to be some weird scam or one of those ridiculous prank posts. Need someone who isn't afraid of a mess. No questions asked. You'll be paid in cash up front for one night's work. If interested, message the handler at the provided link. That was it. No other details. No contact info besides the handle. Something about the post felt off. Like, who pays 10 grand for a few hours of cleaning, right? But I was broke, and curiosity has always been my downfall. So, I shot a quick message, honestly not expecting a response. I figured, worst case, I could just ghost if it turned out to be sketchy. An hour later, I got a reply. Your services are required tonight. Bring gloves, boots, and something you can burn after. Do not ask questions. Do not speak about this. Meet at the coordinates attached at 11 p.m. sharp. Your payment will be in an unmarked envelope waiting for you on arrival. If you're late, the deal's off. Now, this is the part where most people would have backed out, but there was something hypnotizing about how straightforward it was. Plus, $10,000 for one night? I couldn't say no. The coordinates led me to a rural spot about an hour outside the city, middle of nowhere. We're talking no streetlights, no houses, just trees and dirt roads. I had a bad feeling in my gut, but I told myself it was just nerves. After all, what's the worst that could happen? I assumed I was being hired to clean up after some backwoods meth lab bust, or maybe something related to the local underground gambling scene. Nothing I couldn't handle. I packed up my car with some old clothes, gloves, a pair of boots, and a big bottle of bleach, figuring I'd be scrubbing something nasty. By the time I left, it was pitch black outside. No moon, no stars, just that unsettling darkness that clings to everything. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. It seemed smarter that way. I mean, if this was legit, no one needed to know I was involved, right? And if it wasn't, well, I didn't want to be the guy who chickened out over nothing. The drive felt longer than it was. I kept checking the clock, watching the minutes tick by, like each second made me question my decision more. Eventually, I reached the spot. It was just an open field, overgrown with weeds, with an old, rusted-out shack in the middle. No cars, no people. My headlights swept across the area, and for a second, I thought maybe this was some elaborate prank. I parked anyway, killed the engine, and waited. Sure enough, sitting on the front step of the shack was a plain white envelope. No markings, no seal, just cash inside when I tore it open. It was all there, $10,000 in $100 bills. My heart was racing now. This was real. And then I noticed something else. A second envelope, smaller than the first, tucked into the folds of the cash. It was addressed to me by name. Follow the light in the woods. Don't stray from the path. I can't explain why, but reading that chilled me to the bone. There was something so final about it, like I was being warned. Still, I had come this far. I wasn't about to turn back, not with 10 grand already in my hand. So I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my gloves, and walked into the woods. There was a path, or at least what looked like one. It wasn't a man-made trail, more like an area where the trees just didn't grow as densely. My flashlight flickered as I went, and I remember thinking that this was all some bizarre setup for a horror movie. The air was thick and damp, and the deeper I went, the harder it was to breathe. The silence was the worst part though. No birds, no bugs, just my footsteps crunching on dead leaves. Then, about 10 minutes in, I saw it. A light, like the note said. Except this wasn't a lantern or a flashlight beam. It was hovering, moving slowly between the trees, casting these weird shadows that didn't make any sense. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave right then and there. But the money. I just kept thinking about the money. So I followed the light. The further I went, the more I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like rotting meat, but it grew stronger the closer I got to the light. I felt sick, but I pushed through. And then the trees opened up into another clearing. What I saw made me stop in my tracks. It wasn't just one light. There were several of them, hovering above something in the middle of the clearing. Something big, wrapped in a black tarp, with deep red stains leaking through the fabric. Beside it, standing perfectly still, was a man in a hazmat suit. He didn't move when he saw me, didn't even acknowledge me. He just stood there, staring at the thing on the ground. My job had just begun, and suddenly, I wasn't so sure $10,000 was worth it. The moment I stepped into the clearing, I felt this overwhelming sense of wrongness. You know that feeling when you're somewhere you're absolutely not supposed to be, like sneaking into a restricted area, or finding yourself lost in a place that just feels off. Yeah, it was like that, only worse. The man in the hazmat suit still hadn't moved. He was just standing there, like he'd been waiting for me. His mask was tinted, so I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching. It took everything in me not to turn and run, but I'd come this far, and with 10 grand on the line, I figured I at least needed to see what I was getting myself into. I approached slowly, trying not to gag from the stench. It was like something had died and been left out in the sun for weeks. The tarp, it was massive too. Like, I couldn't tell if it was covering a car or something else. But whatever was underneath it, it wasn't human. The shape was all wrong. Too long, too thick in places. Almost like it was trying to hide something much larger than what was visible. My mind went to all sorts of messed up places. Was this some kind of animal? Or worse, a body? Before I could even ask, the man in the hazmat suit finally moved. He didn't speak, didn't explain anything. He just bent down, grabbed the corner of the tarp, and pulled it back in one smooth motion. What I saw underneath, It wasn't something I could have prepared for. Even now, thinking about it makes my stomach churn. It wasn't a person, and it definitely wasn't an animal. The thing lying on the ground looked like it was part human, but only barely. Its skin was this sickly, pale gray, stretched too tight over an unnaturally long frame. The arms, they were twisted, elongated, ending in fingers that were more like claws than anything I'd ever seen. But the face was the worst part. Its eyes were way too big, round, and dark, like two giant voids that just sucked in the light. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing rows of tiny, sharp teeth, like a shark's. There were no lips, just an unsettling grin carved into its skin. It wasn't breathing, at least not that I could see, but there was this faint, high-pitched noise coming from it, like a buzzing, almost like something mechanical, but organic at the same time. I took a step back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "What the hell is that?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The guy in the suit didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a shovel. Just handed it to me, like I was supposed to know what to do. "You're cleaning this up?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You want me to bury this?" He nodded once, then pointed to the far side of the clearing. I squinted through the darkness and realized there was already a hole. A deep one, freshly dug. I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. But there was this part of me, this stupid, greedy part, that kept reminding me of the money. I mean, how bad could it be, right? Just throw it in the hole, cover it up, and leave. That's all they wanted. So I grabbed the shovel. The second I touched the creature, though, everything changed. Its skin was cold, colder than anything I've ever felt, like touching dry ice. And when I tried to lift it, the body didn't move like it should. It was stiff, rigid, like it had been dead for days, but its limbs shifted in ways that didn't make sense, like the bones weren't where they were supposed to be, or maybe it didn't have bones at all. I had to fight back the urge to vomit. The man in the suit just stood there, watching me struggle as I tried to drag this thing across the ground. The buzzing sound got louder the more I moved it, and I kept getting these weird flashes of light in the corner of my eyes, like something was hovering just outside my vision, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing there. Just the darkness and those floating lights still circling above us. It took everything in me to get that thing to the hole. My muscles ached, my hands were shaking, and the smell, God, it was unbearable. I finally got it to the edge of the pit and shoved it in. I didn't even care if it landed right. I just wanted it gone. As soon as it hit the bottom, that buzzing stopped. I thought I was done. I thought that was it. But then, the guy in the hazmat suit pulled something else out from behind the shack. It looked like a metal case, small, with a keypad on the front. He set it down next to the hole, then pointed at me again. I didn't understand at first. I mean, I'd done what they asked, right? But then he gestured to the case, and it clicked. Whatever was in there, I was supposed to use it. I bent down, and the case made this weird hum when I opened it. Inside was a small silver device. It looked like some kind of remote, but with a thick antenna sticking out of the top, and a single red button. No markings, no labels, just that button. I glanced back at the guy, waiting for him to explain. He didn't. He just nodded. I stood there, staring at that button, my hands shaking. Whatever this was, whatever it was about to do. I had a feeling it was going to be bad, really bad, but I pressed it. For a second, Nothing happened. The forest was silent again. Too silent. The air was so still, it felt like time had stopped. Then, all at once, the ground beneath me started to rumble. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to make me stumble. I could hear something too. This deep, low growl, almost like the earth itself was breathing. I stepped back, my heart racing, as the hole, the one I'd just tossed that thing into, began to cave in on itself. The dirt collapsed, filling the pit with this eerie, unnatural precision, like it was being pulled down from below. In less than a minute, it was like the hole had never been there. The ground was smooth, untouched, and the buzzing was gone. The man in the hazmat suit finally spoke. His voice was muffled, mechanical, but I heard him clear as day. "It's not dead. They never are." Before I could even process what that meant, he turned and started walking back into the woods. Without another word, without a glance back, he vanished into the trees, leaving me alone in that clearing, the empty case still at my feet. That's when I realized something. I had done exactly what they wanted, but I didn't feel any safer. Whatever we just buried, it wasn't staying underground, and I had a feeling this wasn't the last time I'd see it. The moment the man in the hazmat suit disappeared into the woods, I felt like the air had changed. Everything was quieter than it should have been. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the usual hum of distant traffic you hear, even in rural places. It was like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the spot where the ground had swallowed up that thing. It didn't feel real. None of it did. But when I looked down at my hands, still trembling from what I'd done, I knew it was. The weight of that shovel still lingered, the stench of decay still clinging to my clothes, and no amount of cash could make me forget that feeling. I thought about just leaving, bolting from my car, and getting the hell out of there. But a part of me knew it wouldn't be that simple. You don't just walk away from something like this. It sticks with you, follows you, haunts you. And there was still the matter of the job. The cash was real, but there was this gnawing feeling inside me that it came with strings attached. Strings I hadn't fully realized yet. I forced myself to move, to head back toward my car. The woods felt different on the return trip, though. It wasn't just that they were darker, although they were. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The trees felt closer, like they were leaning in, watching me. Every crack of a branch under my feet sounded like it was amplified, echoing back at me in this unnerving way. My flashlight flickered again, just like before, and I swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing, just shadows. As I neared the edge of the clearing, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over my own footsteps, but it grew louder the closer I got to my car. A low, rhythmic thumping. Not footsteps, something else. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. There it was again, closer now. It was coming from behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I spun around, shining the flashlight through the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. Just that endless stretch of woods, suffocatingly quiet. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, a deer or something, moving through the underbrush. But that thumping sound didn't feel right. It wasn't natural. It had a pattern, a pulse, almost like footsteps. But they weren't mine. I forced myself to keep walking. The sound didn't stop. It was still there, trailing me, following my every step. I quickened my pace, trying to stay calm, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something back there, lurking just beyond my sight. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled for my keys, nearly dropping them as I unlocked the door. The moment I got in and slammed the door shut, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. I locked the doors, turned the engine on, and floored it. The headlights cut through the darkness as I sped down that dirt road, my heart racing, my mind spinning. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone sitting in the back seat. My brain was playing tricks on me, making me see shapes in the shadows, but there was nothing there. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt like something was watching me. I was halfway back to the city when my phone buzzed. For a second, I ignored it, too focused on the road ahead, trying to get as far away from that place as possible. But the buzzing continued, insistent. I grabbed it off the passenger seat, expecting to see some spam text, or maybe a notification. It wasn't. It was a message from an unknown number. "Good work tonight. The next job will be soon. Stay ready." My stomach dropped. Next job? No. This was supposed to be a one-time thing. That's what I told myself when I agreed to it. Just one night, one job, then I'd be done. But now it seemed like they had other plans for me. I felt sick, like I was trapped in something I didn't fully understand. The drive back felt like it took forever, but eventually I made it home. My apartment felt different when I stepped inside. It used to feel like a safe space, a refuge. But now, it felt small, claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in. The money sat heavy in my pocket, but it didn't feel like a reward. It felt like blood money. I couldn't bring myself to even look at it. I showered, scrubbing my skin raw, trying to wash off the smell, the dirt, the feeling of that creature's cold flesh under my hands. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get rid of it. It was like it had seeped into my bones. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my window made me jump. Every shadow in the corner of my room felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for the right moment to move. I kept the lights on, but it didn't help. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw that thing's face, those empty black eyes, that twisted, unnatural grin. And then I heard it, that same low, rhythmic thumping from the woods, except this time it was right outside my window. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. I wanted to believe it was just a dream, that my mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. But there it was, again, that same sound, closer now, louder, like something was out there, waiting. I got out of bed, slowly, my feet barely making a sound on the floor as I crept toward the window. The blinds were closed, but I could see a faint light through the slats. I hesitated, my hand hovering just inches from the cord, too afraid to open them. My heart was in my throat, every instinct screaming at me not to look. But I did, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing in the middle of the street, bathed in the eerie glow of a streetlight, was the man in the hazmat suit. He wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still, staring up at my window. And behind him, floating just above the ground, were the lights. Those same lights from the clearing. They had followed me. I froze, staring out the window, my breath caught in my throat. The man in the hazmat suit just stood there, motionless, bathed in the harsh light of the street lamp. His mask was turned directly toward my window, But it wasn't just him. Those floating lights, they were there too, hovering, silent, almost watching. I didn't know what to do. Do I run? Do I hide? Call the police? What would I even say? Hey, there's a guy in a hazmat suit standing outside my place with some weird floating lights. Number that wasn't going to work. I stood there, gripping the edge of the windowsill, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The lights from the clearing had followed me home. Suddenly, the man in the suit moved. He raised his hand, slowly, and pointed at me. No words, just that slow, deliberate motion. His arm extended toward my window, and my heart nearly stopped. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stood there, locked in place. Then he started walking. I backed away from the window, my body finally catching up with my brain's panic. I stumbled into the kitchen, knocking over a chair as I went. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep a grip on my phone. I dialed 911, my fingers fumbling over the screen, but the call wouldn't go through. Just static. It was like the air around me was thick, pressing down on everything, distorting reality. The lights outside pulsed, growing brighter, casting long, twisted shadows through the blinds. I slammed the phone down, cursing under my breath. I couldn't think straight. Every part of me screamed to get out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I left, if I stepped outside, I wouldn't be coming back. There was a knock at the door. Just 3 knocks. Slow, purposeful, like he wanted me to know he was there. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard, it felt like it was about to burst. I didn't move. I couldn't. The only thing between me and whatever was out there was a thin wooden door, and somehow, that wasn't much comfort. Another knock. I backed up against the far wall, keeping my eyes on the door. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. Why was he here? What did he want? And those lights, what were they? Were they alive? Were they part of him? Then I heard the doorknob turn. Slowly, the metal creaked as it twisted, and I realized I hadn't locked it. My blood ran cold. The door swung open, revealing nothing but the dim light of the hallway. No man, no lights, just empty space. I stayed pressed against the wall, waiting for something to happen, waiting for him to step inside, but he didn't. The door stayed open, and the hallway was still. My mind was screaming at me to run, to hide, to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. It felt like the air itself was suffocating me, pressing down harder with each second that passed. Then I saw it, a shadow, slowly stretching across the hallway floor, not from the light, but from something else, something just out of sight. The man in the suit was there, but he wasn't stepping inside. He was waiting, like he was daring me to come to him. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I took a step toward the door. My legs felt heavy, like I was moving through water, but I kept going, one slow, shaky step after another. My hands were clammy, my breath shallow, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I had to see what he wanted. When I reached the doorway, I looked down the hall. The man in the hazmat suit was standing at the far end near the stairwell. His hand was still raised, pointing at me. His mask, that featureless tinted visor, seemed to glint in the dim light. The floating lights were there too, hovering behind him, casting these unnatural glows that flickered and pulsed like they were alive. He didn't move. He just stood there, waiting for me to make the next move. Then, without warning, the lights blinked out. Gone. Like someone flipped a switch. 1 second they were there. The next, nothing. That's when I felt it. A presence. Something behind me. My body tensed up, my muscles locking in place. I didn't want to turn around, but I could feel it there. Something cold. Something watching. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and my heart pounded so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. Slowly, I turned my head. At first, I didn't see anything. Just my apartment, dimly lit by the overhead light. But then, in the reflection of the hallway mirror, I saw it. The thing from the clearing. The thing I buried. It was standing just behind me. Its pale gray skin stretched tight over its twisted, unnatural frame. Its black, soulless eyes locked onto mine through the reflection. And that grin, that awful, jagged grin, was wider than before, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I gasped, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I turned to face it directly. But the second I did, it was gone. Just gone. The space behind me was empty again, like it had never been there. But I knew what I saw. My chest tightened, my mind racing. How was that possible? I buried it. I watched the earth swallow it up. But somehow, it had come back. And now it was here, in my apartment, watching me. That's when the lights in the hall flickered. The man in the hazmat suit was gone too, vanished without a trace. The hallway felt wrong, like the walls were closing in, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I slammed the door shut, locking it this time, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I backed away from the entrance, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there were no answers, just fear, pure, unrelenting fear. And then, through the thin walls of my apartment, I heard something, a scratching sound, slow, deliberate, like nails scraping against metal. It started from the direction of the front door, then moved around the side of the building, closer, louder. It was circling my apartment. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands trembling, knowing full well it wouldn't do a damn thing against whatever was out there. But it made me feel a little less helpless, a little less afraid. The scratching stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. My heart raced as I stood there, knife in hand, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. But the silence dragged on. It was unbearable, the anticipation suffocating me. And then, from just outside my window, came a voice. "You can't bury them. They'll always find a way back." It was the same voice I'd heard in the woods, the man in the hazmat suit, but there was something else in his voice now. A warning. Maybe even regret. I didn't dare move, didn't dare speak. "They're not dead," the voice continued, softer now, almost like a whisper. "They never die." The lights outside my window flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. I glanced toward the blinds, half expecting to see the man standing there again, but the window was empty. And then, as quickly as it had started, the voice stopped. The scratching, the lights, all of it, gone. I was left standing in my apartment, knife in hand, alone. But I wasn't really alone, because I knew deep down that the thing I'd buried wasn't gone. It was still out there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see it. That thing, with its pale, twisted body and hollow black eyes. The thought of it lurking in the shadows of my apartment, waiting for the right moment to show itself again, kept me on edge. The knife I'd grabbed earlier was still clutched in my hand, but I knew it was useless. What good is a blade against something that shouldn't exist? The hours dragged on, and eventually, the sun began to rise. The light trickling through my window should have brought some comfort, but it didn't. The shadows still felt wrong, longer than they should have been, like they were hiding something. I was exhausted, running on pure adrenaline, but I knew one thing: I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, it had followed me, and I had no idea how far it would go. My phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a notification. Another message. Same unknown number. Tonight. Same place. I stared at the words, a chill running down my spine. It was happening again. They wanted me to go back to the clearing, to bury something else. Or worse, maybe bury someone this time. I should have ignored it. Should have thrown my phone out the window, packed a bag, and disappeared. But part of me knew that wasn't an option. They wouldn't let me just walk away. This wasn't something you could escape. I had a feeling they'd find me no matter where I went. The day passed in a blur of paranoia and dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in broad daylight. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I was spiraling, caught in this constant loop of fear and confusion, and through it all, that damn message kept replaying in my mind. Tonight, same place. By the time night fell, I knew I didn't have a choice. I had to go back. I didn't bother packing this time. I just grabbed my car keys and left, the weight of what I was about to face sinking into me with every step I took toward the door. The drive out to the clearing was a blur. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of everything. What was this thing? Why me? And most importantly, what was I covering up? When I finally pulled up to the clearing, it was the same as before. Dark, silent, empty. But something felt different. The air was heavier, thicker, like it was suffocating me. And those lights, those floating lights from before, were already there. They hovered in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the trees, flickering in that strange, rhythmic pattern. I parked the car and stepped out, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't know what to expect. Was the man in the hazmat suit going to be here again? Was there something else waiting for me? I didn't have to wonder for long. As I approached the center of the clearing, I saw it, the top, the same black top from the first night. Only this time, whatever was underneath it was bigger, much bigger. The shape was all wrong again, twisted and unnatural, like it was something that didn't belong in this world. My stomach churned at the sight of it, and standing beside it, as if he had been waiting for me, was the man in the hazmat suit. He didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me through that tinted visor, his posture stiff, almost robotic. He didn't need to explain what I was supposed to do. I already knew. The shovel was lying in the dirt next to the top. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and bent down to grab it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on the handle, but I forced myself to move, to start digging. The earth was loose, like it had already been disturbed recently, and that sickening smell, the smell of rot and decay, hit me like a wave. I dug for what felt like hours, the hole getting deeper and deeper, but the whole time I couldn't stop thinking about what was under that tarp. Was it another one of those creatures, or something worse? And why did they keep sending me back here, making me do this? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pit was deep enough. I dropped the shovel, my arms aching, and turned back to the man in the hazmat suit. He gave a slight nod, then walked over to the top. Just like before, he grabbed the edge and pulled it back. I wish I could say I was ready for what I saw, but nothing could have prepared me. It wasn't just one of those creatures. It was several. Their bodies were twisted together, tangled in this grotesque mass of limbs and pale, lifeless flesh. Their eyes, those same hollow black eyes, stared up at me, unblinking. Some of them had their mouths open, frozen in these hideous, toothy grins, while others looked like they had been melted together, their features barely recognizable. But the worst part, one of them moved, just slightly, its arm twitching in the moonlight. It wasn't dead, not completely, and the buzzing sound, that awful, high-pitched buzzing from before, filled the air again, louder this time, more insistent, like the creatures were trying to communicate, trying to tell me something. My blood ran cold. "They never die," the man in the hazmat suit said, his voice low, muffled through the mask. "You can't kill them. You can only bury them, keep them hidden." I stepped back, my mind reeling. What the hell were these things? Aliens? Monsters? Something worse? And why was I the one they'd chosen to deal with this? "They want us to think they're dead," the man continued, his tone disturbingly calm. "But they're not. They're waiting. Always waiting." I opened my mouth to say something, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I couldn't think straight, couldn't process what was happening. "They'll keep coming back," the man said, almost as if he was reading my mind. "No matter how many times you bury them, no matter how deep, they'll always come back." I stood there staring down at the pit, at the twisted mass of creatures staring back at me with those soulless eyes. I wanted to run, to get out of there and never come back, but I couldn't move, because deep down, I knew he was right. These things, they weren't going to stay buried, not forever, and sooner or later, they'd find their way back, and I'd be the one they'd come for. The man in the suit nodded toward the shovel again. "Finish it." I didn't have a choice. I grabbed the shovel and started covering them up, my hands trembling with every scoop of dirt I threw over their twisted bodies. The buzzing sound grew louder, almost like a warning, but I kept going, faster now, desperate to get it over with. Finally, the pit was filled. The creatures were buried, hidden beneath the earth again, but I knew it wasn't permanent. It was only a matter of time before they came back. The man in the hazmat suit turned and walked back into the woods, leaving me alone in the clearing. I watched him disappear into the darkness, my body still shaking, my mind still reeling from what I'd just seen. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the fresh grave I'd just made, but eventually I turned and made my way back to the car. The floating lights were gone now, and the forest was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I drove home in silence, the weight of what I'd done, what I'd seen, hanging heavy over me. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak, every shadow felt like it was watching me, waiting, just like before, because I knew deep down that this wasn't over. It was never going to be over. Those things, whatever they were still out there, and they weren't going to stay buried. Not forever. I was hired on the dark web for a secret mission in Antarctica. The aliens we found are still alive. You ever come across something so strange online that you have to convince yourself it's a joke just to sleep at night? Yeah, this isn't one of those stories. What happened to me? It's real, and I need to get it off my chest before it eats me alive. Let me back up a little. I'm not some weirdo who spends all his time on the dark web or anything. I'm just a guy with a decent job, average life, maybe a little too much curiosity for my own good. I'd heard of the dark web before, like, who hasn't? Drugs, weapons, sketchy stuff you don't want your grandma to know about. But I wasn't interested in that. I was always more fascinated by the idea that there were jobs and opportunities hidden in those corners, the kind no one ever talks about. It started on a Tuesday night, after a few beers and way too much free time. I stumbled onto a forum, nothing major, just a place where people exchanged leads on odd jobs that paid well if you didn't ask too many questions. I'd done some freelance coding here and there, so I figured, why not? Maybe there was something worth checking out. One post stood out immediately. It was vague, which of course made it more intriguing. No details, just a title. Looking for tech-savvy individuals, remote travel involved, discretion required, big payout. There was something about the phrasing that was off, but at the same time, I couldn't help but click. It led to a dead link, nothing new for dark web stuff. But right before I closed the tab, I got a private message from a user with an unpronounceable string of letters and numbers. "You interested in the job?" the message read. Now, this is where a smart person would have closed their laptop and gone to bed. But I'm not always the smartest person when it comes to resisting curiosity. "Depends. What's the job?" I typed back. I waited a few minutes, half expecting some sort of phishing attempt or a virus, but the response I got made me sit up straighter. "Expedition to Antarctica. You'll be part of a team. We need someone with your skill set. Tech setup, monitoring, security. No experience required with the location, but we need you to be discreet. Very discreet." This wasn't a joke. At least it didn't feel like one. "Antarctica," I typed back. "What kind of tech work are you doing there?" It took a while for the next reply to come through, and I could almost feel the weight behind it. "We're investigating something buried under the ice." That's when the chills started. I wasn't scared, not yet. More like curious. No one just digs around in Antarctica for fun. Whatever they were after, it was serious. "How much are we talking for this?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light while my pulse picked up speed. $250,000. That was enough to make my head spin. I mean, I wasn't desperate for money, but who says no to that kind of cash? I was already daydreaming about paying off my student loans, getting a new car, maybe even quitting my job. But then came the catch. You'll have to sign an NDA. No talking about this to anyone, ever. If you do, it won't be pretty. I paused. Look, I've seen enough shady stuff online to know this could be a scam, or worse. But the promise of $250,000 and the thrill of going somewhere as remote as Antarctica, I couldn't resist. Besides, what could go wrong, right? I was just going to do some tech work, set up a few systems, maybe babysit some equipment for a month or two, and walk away $250,000 richer. So, I agreed. "Send me the details," I replied, my heart pounding harder than I'd like to admit. Within minutes, I received a packet of encrypted documents, instructions on how to fly out to a private airfield in Chile. From there, a cargo plane would take me to Antarctica. A month-long expedition, fully paid for. They even promised I'd be back home before Christmas. Easy, right? Except I couldn't shake this weird feeling, like there was something they weren't telling me. Something buried deeper than the ice. I ignored it. It's just a job, I told myself. A weird, highly paid job, but still just a job. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, I think I already knew. This wasn't going to be as simple as they made it sound. That's how it all began. With a few clicks, a cryptic message, and an offer I couldn't refuse. And by the time I realized I'd made the biggest mistake of my life, it was already too late. The flight to Chile was uneventful. Too uneventful, actually. Everything about this job so far had been running smoothly. Almost too smoothly. I arrived at the private airfield as instructed, a tiny strip of tarmac hidden in the middle of nowhere. No commercial flights, no tourists, just a handful of worn-out looking guys loading up cargo into a massive, unmarked military plane. No one really spoke to me. I didn't even know if they were part of the same team, or if they were just hired hands who didn't ask questions. But I noticed their eyes, cold, distant, like they knew something I didn't. I boarded the plane with maybe 6 other people, none of whom seemed remotely interested in chatting. They all had that same hollow look, like they'd seen some shit. It was too late to back out though. I was already committed. I figured the job couldn't be that crazy. I mean, who actually finds anything in Antarctica? It's just ice, right? Miles and miles of frozen nothing. Except that's what they want you to think. After what felt like an eternity of sitting in the frigid metal shell of the plane, we touched down. The air that hit me when we landed wasn't just cold, it was bone-shattering. The kind of cold that feels like it's sinking into your skin, like it's reaching inside and trying to freeze you from the inside out. The sky was a dull gray, and everything around us was flat, white, and completely still. No life, no noise, just an endless expanse of nothing. Waiting for us at the airstrip was a convoy of snowcats, big, hulking machines designed to crawl over the ice. That's when I met the team. Finally, people started talking, though it wasn't exactly comforting. There was Dr. Morgan, the lead scientist, a man in his mid-50s with thinning hair and a permanent scowl. He didn't even bother with pleasantries, just gave me a hard look and nodded. Then there was a woman named Katya, a geologist from somewhere in Eastern Europe, who seemed too serious for her own good. The rest were grunts, guys who looked like ex-military, the kind of people who you don't want to piss off. No one smiled, no one joked. It was like they all knew what was coming. I still didn't. They loaded me into one of the snowcats without a word, and we began our trek into the deep. I didn't realize until later that we were headed to a place completely off the maps, a place no satellite would even pick up. As we drove deeper into the frozen wasteland, Dr. Morgan finally gave me the rundown. The mission, as they put it, was simple. I was there to set up monitoring equipment for a dig site that they had been working on for months. The way he said dig site, though, it felt wrong. So, what exactly are you digging for? I asked, trying to sound casual, even though I could feel my pulse quicken. Dr. Morgan stared straight ahead, his jaw tightening. It's hard to explain. Hard to explain. That was a red flag, if I ever heard one. He didn't offer any more details, so I let it drop. But the tension in the air kept growing, like we were heading towards something no one wanted to face, but no one could stop. After what felt like hours, we reached the site. At first glance, it was just a cluster of tents and portable labs sitting on the ice, surrounded by nothing but endless snow dunes. But as we got closer, I noticed something that immediately made my stomach drop. There was a hole. No, not a hole. A pit. a massive, perfectly circular opening in the ice, at least 50 feet wide. The edges were smooth, too smooth. It didn't look natural, like something had burned its way through the ice from below. I couldn't see the bottom. "This is the site?" I asked, my voice cracking a little as I stared down into that black abyss. Dr. Morgan gave me that same hard look he had given when we first met. "This is where you'll be working. You'll set up the equipment. Your job is to monitor the signals." "Signals? What kind of signals?" I was already regretting every decision that had led me here. "We don't know yet." That was all he said before walking off, leaving me standing there, staring into the void. That night, after I set up the tech, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled against the thin walls of my tent, but it wasn't just the cold keeping me awake. Something about that pit, it felt wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I could picture it. Endless, yawning darkness. The next day, they sent a team down into the pit. Dr. Morgan and Katya stayed topside, analyzing the data while I monitored the signals like I'd been told. I don't know what kind of equipment they were using, but my screen was a mess of strange readings, the kind I'd never seen before. Spikes in electromagnetic activity, bizarre fluctuations in temperature, nothing that made any sense for a place as desolate as Antarctica. Then, late in the afternoon, everything went quiet. No signals, no communications, just dead silence from the pit. I waited. I tried to reach Dr. Morgan, but he wasn't answering. No one was. I was completely alone in that tent, the only sound the wind and the low hum of the monitors. Suddenly, the signal spiked again, hard. My screen lit up with rapid bursts of static, like something was trying to communicate, except it wasn't in any language I'd ever seen, just jagged lines, shapes, patterns that made my eyes hurt if I stared too long. Then the comms crackled back to life, but the voice that came through wasn't anyone from the team. It was something else, low, deep, inhuman. The words weren't English. They weren't any language I knew. But somehow, in my gut, I understood exactly what it was saying. "We are awake." I didn't know it then, but whatever we had dug up from that frozen tomb, it wasn't dead, not even close. The voice didn't stop. It kept echoing through the comms, low and guttural, like it was vibrating the air itself. I stared at the radio, my hands frozen on the controls. I wanted to believe it was some kind of interference, maybe the equipment malfunctioning, but deep down, I knew better. That thing, whatever it wasn't human. Suddenly, the voice cut out, leaving only static behind. Then, the screaming started. It came from the pit, so far below that it was barely audible through the howling wind and thick ice. At first, I thought it was just feedback. Maybe one of the team's radios stuck on transmit. But it didn't stop. The longer I listened, the clearer it became. Those were human screams. Terrified, desperate. They weren't words. They were raw, primal terror. I bolted from the tent, stumbling out into the freezing air. Dr. Morgan was already there, standing by the edge of the pit, staring down into that black maw like he was hypnotized. His face was pale, his breath coming out in sharp, shallow bursts. He looked afraid. I'd never seen him scared before. "What the hell is going on down there?" I shouted over the wind, trying to keep my voice steady, though my hands were shaking. He didn't answer, just kept staring, like whatever was happening below was too much for him to process. Katya was pacing by one of the snowcats, her face twisted in confusion and fear. "We lost all comms with the team," she said. more to herself than to me. Though not responding, something must have happened. Yeah, no kidding, I muttered under my breath, staring at the pit. That thing, that voice, it wasn't my imagination. Something was down there, and it was alive. Dr. Morgan finally snapped out of his daze, his face hardening with determination. We need to get them back. Now. He turned to one of the ex-military guys, a stocky dude named Burke, who seemed to handle most of the dirty work. Take a team down. Get them out. Burke hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the pit, but he nodded. Without a word, he grabbed his gear and motioned for a few other guys to follow. They started suiting up, pulling on harnesses and ropes, checking their flashlights and radios. I could tell by the look on their faces they didn't want to go down there, but orders were orders. I stood by, watching as they descended into the pit one by one, their headlamps disappearing into the darkness below. Each minute they were gone felt like a year. The wind howled louder, like it was carrying whispers from the abyss itself. And then, after what felt like forever, the radio crackled to life again. Burke here. We're near the bottom. His voice was faint, strained. Something's wrong. What do you mean, wrong? Dr. Morgan demanded, gripping the radio tightly. There was a pause, long enough to make my heart race. Then Burke's voice came through again, shaking this time. The team. They're not here. What do you mean, they're not there? Katya yelled, her eyes wide with panic. I mean, they're gone, Burke snapped back, his voice rising. Their gear's here, the lights, the tools, everything, but no bodies. It's like they just disappeared. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. People don't just vanish. Not in a place like this. Not anywhere. Get out of there, Dr. Morgan ordered, his voice cold and firm. Now. But Burke didn't move. He just stood there, breathing heavily into the radio. We found something else, he said, barely above a whisper. It's huge. What are you talking about? Morgan asked, but I could hear the tremor in his voice now. He wasn't as calm as he pretended to be. Burke didn't respond right away. I could hear the sound of shuffling, boots crunching on ice, and then the unmistakable click of a flashlight being turned on. A sharp gasp came over the radio. One of the other men, not Burke. He sounded horrified. It's a structure, Burke finally said. Jesus Christ, it's not from here. I felt my stomach drop. A structure? What kind of structure? Morgan demanded, his voice cracking slightly. It's not man-made, that's for damn sure, Burke said, his voice shaky now, like he was fighting to stay in control. It's like a temple or something, but it's covered in these markings, symbols. They don't look human. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. A temple? Under the ice? None of this made sense. Nothing about this place made sense. We're coming back up, Burke said quickly, his voice tight with fear. We need to. There was a loud crack over the radio, followed by shouting. It sounded like an avalanche, but worse. Burke's voice came through again, distorted by static, panicked now. Something's down here. Jesus, run. Then, nothing. Silence. I stood there, staring at the radio in Dr. Morgan's hand, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. No one moved. No one spoke. We all knew deep down that whatever they had found down there, it wasn't going to let them leave. Before I could even process what was happening, Katya turned to me, her face pale. We need to go down there. We need to help them. My mouth went dry. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to say no, to stay as far away from that pit as possible. But I couldn't just stand by and do nothing, not after hearing those screams. I grabbed a harness, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the straps. Dr. Morgan didn't even try to stop us. He just stood there, staring blankly into the distance, like his mind had already checked out. Katya and I descended into the pit, our headlamps barely cutting through the darkness. The deeper we went, the colder it got, until the air felt thick with frost. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, echoing off the walls of ice. When we finally reached the bottom, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the crisp, clean scent of frozen air. It was foul, like something old and rotting, buried deep beneath the ice for centuries. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to gag. Then I saw it. The structure. It loomed in the darkness, massive and ancient, half buried in the ice, like some forgotten relic. The surface was smooth, unnaturally so, covered in symbols that hurt to look at, like they were shifting when I wasn't paying attention. Katya froze beside me, her eyes wide. "This can't be real," she whispered, her voice trembling. This shouldn't exist." But it did, and that's when I realized. We had dug too deep. It's hard to explain what it feels like to be standing in front of something that shouldn't exist, something that couldn't exist. The structure was immense, its dark surface swallowing the light from our headlamps, like it was feeding off it. The symbols etched into the stone, if you could call it stone, pulsed with a faint, sickly glow that made me feel like I was being watched. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. It was like the patterns were alive, writhing beneath the surface, trying to crawl into my brain. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and the foul stench of decay clung to the back of my throat. Next to me, Katya was whispering something in her native language, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Whatever this was, it was ancient, far older than humanity itself. "We shouldn't be here," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the wind echoing from above. "This is wrong." For a moment, I considered running, climbing back up the ropes and getting as far away from this cursed place as possible. But the thought of Burke and the others, lost somewhere in the darkness, stopped me. They were still down here, somewhere. Or what was left of them. "Burke!" I shouted, my voice sounding small and hollow in the vast frozen chamber. "Can you hear me?" No response, just the distant sound of wind howling like a warning, and the dull thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I took a step forward, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. Something metallic caught the beam of my headlamp. I crouched down, brushing the snow away with trembling fingers. It was one of the radios from the team. The casing was cracked, but the real horror wasn't the damage. It was the blood. Thick, dark stains smeared across the equipment, still fresh enough to glisten in the light. "Jesus," I whispered, backing away, my pulse quickening. Katya saw it too, and her face went pale. "Something happened to them," she said, her voice shaking. "Something bad." That much was obvious. But what kind of bad? There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, just the blood and the eerie silence that stretched endlessly in every direction. It was as if the ice had swallowed them whole. As I stood there, trying to figure out what to do next, a low rumble shook the ground beneath my feet. At first, I thought it was another tremor, like the ones we'd felt on the way down, but this was different. The vibration wasn't coming from the earth. It was coming from the structure itself. The symbols began to glow brighter, flickering like they were alive, pulsing in rhythm with the rumble. Katya grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my jacket. "We need to go," she hissed, panic creeping into her voice. "Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. We turned to leave, but the path behind us was no longer the same. The walls of the pit seemed to shift, the ice groaning as if it was closing in on us. The way we had come down was now blocked by thick sheets of ice, like the earth itself was sealing us in. A cold dread settled over me. We were trapped. And that's when I saw it. Movement out of the corner of my eye. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. Katya didn't answer, her eyes locked on something in the distance. She was trembling now, her body stiff as a board. Slowly, she raised a shaking finger, pointing toward the far end of the structure. I followed her gaze, and my blood turned to ice. There was a figure. It stood in the shadows, just beyond the reach of our headlamps. Its outline was human, sort of, but wrong. The limbs were too long, the posture twisted, hunched, as if it had been distorted by centuries of confinement. And its skin was pale, almost translucent, like it had never seen sunlight. At first, I thought it was one of the team, someone who'd survived, maybe. But as it moved, I realized that whatever this thing was, it wasn't one of us. It didn't move like a person. It moved like something that had forgotten how to be human. Its head twitched, jerking from side to side, as if it was sniffing the air. And then it turned toward us. That's when I saw its eyes, if you could call them eyes. Hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the light, much like the structure itself. It stared at us, unblinking, its body quivering with unnatural energy. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. And then it smiled, or at least I think it was a smile. Its mouth twisted open in a grotesque, jagged grin that split its face from ear to ear, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that glistened in the dim light. A low, guttural sound escaped its throat, something between a growl and a laugh. Katya let out a strangled sob, her hand tightening on my arm. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. Before I could respond, the figure moved, fast, too fast for something that size. It darted toward us, a blur of pale skin and sharp angles, its arms outstretched, fingers like claws reaching for us. Without thinking, I grabbed Katya's hand and ran. We sprinted across the frozen ground, dodging debris and chunks of ice that had fallen from the pit walls. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it behind us, its ragged breathing growing louder, closer. The entrance to the structure loomed ahead, an arched opening, impossibly smooth and wide enough to swallow a bus. It was our only chance. I pulled Katya with me, and together we plunged into the darkness. Inside, the temperature dropped even further, the air thick with a strange metallic tang that stung my nose. The walls of the structure were smooth to the touch, but they pulsed beneath my fingertips, like they were alive, breathing with us. We stumbled deeper into the labyrinth, our headlamps flickering as the creature's footsteps echoed behind us. The further we went, the more the symbols on the walls began to glow, casting a sickly green light over everything. I didn't understand what they meant, but they felt like a warning, a curse etched into the bones of this place. "We're going to die here," Katya whispered, her voice broken. "This thing, it won't let us leave." "No," I growled, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "We'll find a way out. We have to." But even as I said it, I could feel the walls closing in. The structure wasn't just ancient. It was a prison, a tomb for something far older than humanity, something that had been buried beneath the ice for a reason. And now we had set it free. We ran deeper into the structure, the cold biting harder the further we went. My breath came in ragged bursts, each one feeling like it was tearing my lungs apart. The thing, that creature, was still behind us. I couldn't hear it anymore, but I could feel it, like the air itself was pressing down on me, growing thicker and heavier with each step. Katya stumbled beside me, barely keeping up. Her eyes were wide and glassy, like she was on the verge of breaking down completely. I couldn't blame her. I felt like I was one step away from losing it myself. The tunnel we were in wasn't natural. The smooth black walls glistened under the faint green glow of the symbols, and every time I brushed against them, I could feel a faint vibration, like a heartbeat. The walls were alive. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a structure or a temple. It was part of something much larger, something buried deep beneath the ice, a living organism, ancient and incomprehensible, and we had disturbed it. We finally reached a massive chamber at the end of the tunnel. The ceiling stretched high above, disappearing into the darkness. In the center of the room was an enormous black stone, slick and cold, covered in those same shifting symbols that seemed to pulse with life. The air here felt thicker, denser, like gravity itself was different. Katya fell to her knees, gasping for breath, her eyes locked on the stone. This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is what we were never supposed to find." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but I didn't need to. The stone wasn't just a marker or an artifact. It was a gateway. I could feel it. Something was on the other side, and it wanted out. Suddenly, the ground beneath us shook violently, sending us both sprawling. The rumbling sound that followed wasn't just coming from the earth. It was coming from below, from inside the stone. I scrambled to my feet, pulling Katya up with me. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." But before we could move, the stone cracked. It was subtle at first, just a thin line that ran down its center, glowing faintly. Then another, and another. The cracks spread rapidly, glowing with that sickly green light, until the entire surface of the stone was fractured. The noise, the deep, rumbling growl, grew louder, vibrating through the floor and up into my bones. I backed away, dragging Katya with me, but it was too late. The stone exploded outward, shards flying in every direction. We hit the ground, barely avoiding the flying debris. I felt something hot and wet on my cheek, and when I touched it, my fingers came away slick with blood. And then I saw it. A figure rose from the shattered remains of the stone, slowly unfolding itself like it had been trapped for millennia. Its body was twisted and grotesque, its limbs far too long, its skin a sickly, translucent gray that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its face, or what was left of it, was featureless, save for those hollow black eyes that stared straight through me. This wasn't the thing that had been chasing us. It was something worse, something ancient, something alien. It didn't move toward us. It didn't need to. I could feel its presence, its mind reaching out, probing, invading. My thoughts weren't my own anymore. I could hear its voice inside my head, a low, guttural hum that twisted my thoughts into something unrecognizable. "You woke me. The words slithered through my brain like oil, dark and suffocating. I tried to fight it, but it was too strong. I felt my body go limp, my vision blurring as the thing's presence overwhelmed me. You don't belong here. It wasn't angry. It wasn't vengeful. It was something far worse. It was indifferent. I managed to look over at Katya. She was frozen, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth moving soundlessly. The thing was inside her head too. We were nothing to it, just ants scurrying around a behemoth, too small and insignificant to matter. You are beneath us. I could feel its thoughts unraveling the very fabric of my mind. Memories, fears, desires, everything was exposed, laid bare before it like an open book. It knew everything, every secret, every weakness, and it didn't care. You woke us. The rumbling beneath the floor grew stronger. The walls of the chamber began to tremble, cracks forming in the ice around us. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't alone. The others were waking too. I had to move. I had to do something. Anything. I grabbed Katya's arm and pulled her up, but she barely responded. Her eyes locked on the creature. I slapped her hard across the face, and the shock seemed to break the hold, at least for a moment. "We need to go," I shouted, shaking her. "Now!" She blinked, dazed, but finally nodded. Together, we ran. We didn't stop. We couldn't. The entire structure was collapsing around us, the ice groaning and cracking, as whatever was buried beneath it began to stir. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the vibrations growing stronger with each step. The tunnel twisted and shifted as we ran, like the whole place was alive and trying to trap us. But we didn't stop. I didn't even know if we were going the right way. I just knew we had to get out. Suddenly, we burst through the entrance of the structure, back into the freezing night air. The wind whipped at my face, the cold biting into my skin, but I barely noticed. I glanced behind us, expecting the creature to be right on our heels, but it wasn't. The pit was silent, empty, but I knew better. The thing wasn't chasing us, because it didn't need to. It was still down there, beneath the ice, waiting, and whatever we had disturbed wasn't going to stay buried for long. Katya collapsed next to me, gasping for breath, her eyes wide with fear. What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. I wasn't sure there was an answer. All I knew was that we had unleashed something far beyond our understanding, something that didn't care about us, or our world, or anything else. I looked up at the sky, the endless expanse of gray and white stretching above us. We had escaped, for now. But the knowledge gnawed at me, deep inside my bones. This wasn't over, not even close. The dark web exposed me to a government plan to evacuate Earth. The aliens are already here. I've always been the kind of guy who's into weird stuff, not like illegal or dangerous. I'm talking about weird in the conspiracy theory rabbit hole kind of way. You know, late night YouTube binges, listening to people with names like Watcher Truth 88 talk about how JFK faked his death, or how the moon landing was a cover-up for something bigger. It was a fun way to pass the time. I never took any of it too seriously, but it was entertaining, right? Anyway, that's what got me into browsing the deep web. Before you start judging me, it wasn't like I was looking for anything sinister. I just wanted to see if any of those weird conspiracy forums had the good stuff. You know how people always say, the real truth isn't on the surface web? Well, my curiosity got the better of me. And let me tell you, I should have just stuck to the surface. But I didn't. I had heard about the dark web from a buddy of mine who was really into hacking, but I wasn't a tech genius or anything. I downloaded Tor, got myself a VPN because I wasn't completely stupid, and started poking around. At first, it was kind of boring, just sketchy marketplaces and forums filled with people who thought they were anonymous or whatever. It wasn't until about 2 weeks in that I stumbled on something really unsettling. There was this forum, no name, no flashy graphics, just a plain black background with white text. The URL was a string of random numbers and letters, so it didn't stick out. But the thread that caught my eye had a title I couldn't ignore. The truth about Project Epsilon. Now, I'd never heard of Project Epsilon. You'd think a conspiracy junkie like me would have seen that name pop up before, right? But nothing. No Google results, no YouTube videos, no whispers on Reddit. Nothing. And that made it even more interesting. The first post was written in this serious, no-nonsense tone, like whoever wrote it was deadly afraid of being found out. It was long, but I'll summarize. Apparently, Project Epsilon was a top-secret government program, and it had something to do with preparing for an upcoming event. Something so big and catastrophic that the government was planning to evacuate Earth. Yeah, I know. It sounded nuts. But the more I read, the more I started to realize this wasn't your usual tinfoil hat stuff. This wasn't some guy in his mom's basement talking about UFO sightings or ancient aliens. The details were way too specific. The timeline was too precise. The post claimed that this wasn't some far-off, maybe in 100 years, kind of event. No, the evacuation was supposed to happen within the next 5 years. And get this, the reason for it wasn't some asteroid or nuclear war. It was aliens. Now, I know what you're thinking, because I thought the same thing. This is crazy. Who believes this stuff? But I kept reading, and the more I read, the more it didn't feel like fiction. It felt real. The guy who wrote the post, he didn't give his name, obviously, said he worked for the government. Something about being involved with communication protocols. He said he'd seen classified documents detailing how these aliens, these things that had apparently been here for decades, were planning to reveal themselves soon. And not in a good way. According to him, the aliens had already infiltrated major world governments. They had influence over decisions, and now they were starting to prepare Earth for something big, something we weren't going to like. I know, it sounds insane, but the guy went on, and the way he described everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some paranoid delusion. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't trying to sell anything. He was just warning people, warning anyone who would listen. The kicker? The post ended with this cryptic sentence. If you're reading this, you're already too late. They know who you are. Now, I'm not someone who freaks out easily, but that last line got to me. It was like a cold hand gripping my spine. I tried to brush it off, told myself it was just some elaborate hoax. But then, something weird happened. Within an hour of reading that post, my computer started acting up. It wasn't normal glitches. I'm talking about my screen flashing, random windows popping up, files getting moved around. And I swear, I heard this faint, high-pitched sound coming from my speakers, like a frequency I couldn't quite make out. It was low at first, but it kept getting louder, like something was tuning in. I unplugged everything, my heart racing, but the damage was done. When I turned my laptop back on, the post was gone. Not just from my history. The entire forum was wiped. It was like it never existed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a coincidence. But that night, things got weirder. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in bed, staring at my laptop, waiting for something else to happen. Maybe my computer would glitch again. Maybe my power would cut out. Maybe I'd hear that sound again. But the night passed without incident. In the morning, I felt ridiculous. I mean, I was an adult, not some kid scared of monsters under the bed. It had to be some prank, right? Someone was messing with me. I laughed it off, told myself it was time to stop going down these rabbit holes, maybe step away from the deep web for a while. Seemed like a solid plan. But here's the thing. I couldn't let it go. Something about that post had wormed its way into my brain, like a splinter. It didn't matter how much I tried to convince myself it was fake. The details were too specific. The way the guy wrote, the urgency in his words, the way he knew things. It stuck with me. So, I started looking into it. I searched for Project Epsilon everywhere I could think of. Even dug through old conspiracy sites that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. Nothing. No whispers, no rumors. But here's the kicker. Every time I tried to look it up, my computer would act up again. It wasn't as bad as that first night, but I'd notice things. My browser would freeze at random times. My internet connection would drop, even though I had full bars. Weird ads would pop up. Not normal ads, but ones in foreign languages. Flashing red text I couldn't even read. Sometimes I'd get this feeling, like someone was behind me, watching over my shoulder. Now I know that sounds paranoid, but after that post, everything just felt off. I started noticing things around my house too. Little details I wouldn't normally pick up on. My front door, which I always lock before bed, would sometimes be unlocked in the morning. I'd hear strange noises at night. Not the usual creaks or groans of an old house settling. These were different, like footsteps, just barely audible, but there. And when I'd turn on the light, everything would be quiet again. The worst part, the dreams. It started about 3 nights after I'd read that post. In the dream, I was standing in an empty street. There were no cars, no people, just rows of houses, each one identical to the next. The sky was this strange, deep gray, like a storm was about to hit. But there was no wind, no movement at all, just this heavy silence. And in the distance, I could see figures, tall, shadowy, standing completely still. They weren't looking at me, at least not at first. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt their eyes on me, like they knew I was there, watching. Every night, it was the same dream. And every night, the figures got a little closer. I didn't tell anyone about this. I mean, how do you even bring it up? Oh, hey, I think I might have seen classified government documents about aliens on the deep web, and now I'm having weird dreams about shadow people. Yeah, no thanks. People would think I was losing it. But something changed about a week later. It was a Tuesday. I was working from home, trying to focus, but I kept getting distracted by that nagging feeling that someone was watching me. You ever get that? Like, even though you're alone, you just know someone's there, lurking just out of sight. That's what it felt like all day. I kept checking the windows, the doors, but everything looked normal, until I got up to grab some coffee. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood, middle of nowhere, really. So, when I looked out my kitchen window and saw a black car parked across the street, I noticed. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone lost, checking directions or something, but the longer I watched, the weirder it got. The car didn't move. No one got out. It just sat there, engine off, windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I went back to my desk, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was being paranoid again. But an hour later, when I checked again, the car was still there, just sitting. No one coming or going, just waiting. I started pacing around the house, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. It could have been anyone. Delivery driver? Random person parked for a while? But something about it felt wrong, so I did the stupidest thing I could have done. I went outside. I stepped out onto the porch, squinting in the afternoon sun, and glanced at the car. No movement. I took a deep breath and started walking toward it, trying to act casual, like I was just checking the mail or something. But as soon as I got halfway across the yard, the car's engine roared to life. The sound startled me, made my heart skip a beat. I froze, expecting the driver to pull away, but the car didn't move. It just sat there, engine rumbling, as if waiting for me to do something. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Should I walk over? Should I go back inside? And then, the car's driver's side window rolled down. Slowly. There was no one in the driver's seat. I swear to you, there was no one inside. The seat was empty, but the car was running, and the window had rolled down on its own. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I managed to take a step closer, trying to see if there was anything in the car that could explain what I was seeing. And that's when I heard it. A voice, coming from the car's speakers. You shouldn't have looked. It was that same high-pitched tone I'd heard through my laptop that first night. That strange frequency, distorted, like it wasn't quite human. My blood ran cold. Before I could react, the window rolled up and the car sped off, tires screeching as it disappeared down the street. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? Was it some kind of threat? A warning? I didn't have time to process it, because that night, things escalated in a way I couldn't have imagined. After that black car sped off, I went back inside, locked every door and window, and just sat there, trying to wrap my head around what had happened. The voice. That strange mechanical voice. It wasn't just in my head. It was real, coming from a car with no driver. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a prank. This was something else entirely. I kept telling myself it was over, that the car was gone and I was safe. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Whatever I'd stumbled onto with that post about Project Epsilon wasn't just some conspiracy theory. It was real. And now it was clear that someone or something knew I'd seen it. That night, the dreams came back, but they were worse. The street from before, it wasn't empty anymore. The houses had lights on, flickering like dying candles, and the figures, those tall, shadowy figures, were everywhere, standing on porches, lurking in doorways, their faces still hidden in shadow. And this time, I wasn't alone. There were others like me, standing in the street, looking just as lost and terrified. The figures didn't move. They just watched. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding in my chest like I'd run a marathon. My phone, which I always kept on silent at night, was buzzing on the nightstand. It was a notification, a live stream notification. I never subscribed to anything that would notify me in the middle of the night, so this instantly put me on edge. The notification was from an app I'd never seen before. and the title was just as cryptic as the post that started all of this. Live broadcast evacuation plan. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the notification. Everything in me was screaming not to open it, to delete the app and go back to sleep. But curiosity, that's always been my problem. I couldn't help it. I tapped the notification and the app opened. No fancy interface, no comments, nothing. Just a video stream. At first, the screen was dark, but then it flickered to life. It was grainy, like an old VHS tape. The picture stabilized, revealing a large, dimly lit room. It looked like a bunker of some kind, with concrete walls and no windows. In the center of the room, there was a single desk, and sitting behind it was a man. He was wearing a military uniform, but something about him felt off. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were wrong. They were too dark, like there was nothing behind them. Just black voids where pupils should have been. For a long moment, the man just stared into the camera, not saying a word, not moving. The silence was deafening. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen, even though my gut was telling me to turn it off. Then, without warning, the man spoke. The evacuation plan is in motion. His voice was flat, monotone, like it wasn't really his voice. It felt like something else was speaking through him, like a puppet. Phase 1 is complete. The population is unaware. Phase 2 begins now. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This wasn't some internet prank. The way he said it, the cold, mechanical certainty in his tone, it felt like he was addressing me personally, like he knew I was watching. They are already here, the man continued, his eyes never blinking. They walk among us. They have been for decades. The project's goal is to ensure their integration. Your government has been preparing for this moment. Soon, Earth will no longer be our home. I was shaking. My hands felt cold as I gripped my phone, my mind racing with 100 questions. Integration, evacuation. What the hell was this? The man leaned forward slightly, as if to emphasize the next words. Phase 3 will initiate global evacuation. Not all will be selected. Selected? Selected for what? My head was spinning. I couldn't make sense of what I was hearing. But I knew one thing. Whatever this was, it was beyond anything I'd imagined. The video suddenly cut to static, the screen flickering again. But before it went dark, I caught a glimpse of something. A flash of a symbol. It looked like a triangle, but with a circle in the middle and strange lines running through it, almost like circuitry. Then the feed died, and I was left staring at my own reflection on the black screen of my phone. My heart was still pounding when I tried to close the app, but as I swiped the screen, the phone froze. No matter what I did, the app wouldn't close. It just stayed there, the black screen mocking me. And then, the phone rang. I didn't even have a chance to react. The call ID was just a blank, white screen. No number, no name. I hesitated for only a second before I answered. I mean, it could have been anything, right? Wrong. There was no voice on the other end, no static. Just that same high-pitched sound again. But this time, it was louder, sharper. I yanked the phone away from my ear, but the sound didn't stop. It kept going, like it was drilling into my brain. I dropped the phone, my head pounding, and then silence. I picked it up again, hands trembling, but the screen was completely dead now. The phone wouldn't turn back on. I sat there in the dark, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. Whatever this was, it was far beyond just some deep web nonsense. This was real. For the next few days, I didn't leave the house. I didn't touch my computer, didn't try to look up anything about Project Epsilon. I didn't sleep much either. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those figures from my dreams. I'd see the man in the bunker, his dead, black eyes staring straight at me. It was like they were waiting for something. And then the knock came. It was late, past midnight, and I'd been sitting on my couch, staring blankly at the TV, trying to ignore the nagging dread that had been hanging over me since the live stream. I heard it, soft but deliberate, a knock at my front door. I didn't move at first. I thought maybe I'd imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. 3 slow knocks. I grabbed my phone, even though it was still dead, and crept to the door. My heart was racing, my hands clammy. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. The porch was empty. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A whisper from the other side of the door, so faint I almost missed it. "You shouldn't have looked." I didn't open the door. I couldn't. That whisper, the way it slithered through the wood like a breath of wind, froze me in place. It wasn't just that the voice was familiar. It was the fact that it was coming from someone, or something, standing right outside my house in the dead of night. But no matter how long I stood there, looking through the peephole, the porch remained empty. The knock stopped. The whisper faded, but the fear lingered. I backed away from the door slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. My head was spinning with thoughts. Had someone followed me? Was it the government? The aliens? Whoever or whatever was behind Project Epsilon? I didn't know. I wasn't even sure I wanted to find out. I went upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door, as if that would somehow keep the nightmare out. I climbed into bed, pulled the covers up to my chin, and waited for morning to come. It was a long, silent wait. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, felt like a warning. By the time the sun rose, I was more exhausted than I'd ever been in my life, but at least it was morning. That somehow made it easier to pretend everything was normal, even if I knew it wasn't. That day, I went back to my routine, or at least I tried to. Work was impossible. I couldn't focus on anything for more than 5 minutes without feeling like I was being watched. And I was. I knew it. The black car returned. This time, it parked further down the street, almost out of view. But I could feel it. I didn't dare go outside again, didn't even open the blinds to peek at it. I just knew it was there. Hours passed, and the car didn't move. It just sat there, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe it was just paranoia taking hold. Maybe the knock last night was a prank, and the car was someone else's problem. But then, my phone buzzed. My heart nearly stopped. I had thrown it on my nightstand after it died during the live stream, and I hadn't touched it since. The battery was completely drained, yet here it was, vibrating like it had life again. Slowly, I picked it up, my hand trembling. The screen flickered to life, but there was no text, no app notification, just one single word in the center of the screen, blinking in and out like a glitch. Soon. That was it. Just that one word. I tried to turn the phone off, but the screen wouldn't respond. The word just kept blinking. Soon, 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 until the phone finally died again, leaving me staring at my reflection in the black screen. I couldn't stay there anymore. I grabbed my jacket and keys, threw them into a backpack, and bolted out of the house. I needed to get away. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere felt safer than there. As I backed out of my driveway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The black car was gone. My hands were shaking as I drove, eyes darting between the road and my mirrors, expecting the car to reappear behind me. But it didn't. I kept driving for what felt like hours, my mind racing. I was half convinced that the government or aliens or whoever was involved in this mess had somehow put a target on my back, and no matter where I went, they'd find me. Eventually, I found myself pulling into an empty gas station off the highway. The place looked abandoned, its neon sign flickering dimly in the twilight. I parked near one of the pumps and just sat there for a while, trying to calm down. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a phone booth near the gas station, an old beat-up thing that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But the receiver was off the hook, hanging limply by its cord. The weird part? I could hear it ringing. I stared at the phone for a long moment, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't random. This was for me. Reluctantly, I got out of the car and walked over to the phone booth. The ringing was steady, unchanging, as if it had been waiting for me. My hands were slick with sweat as I picked up the receiver and put it to my ear. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible. For a moment, there was silence. Then, that same high-pitched frequency came through the line. It was sharper this time, like it was drilling into my skull. I winced, holding the phone away from my ear, but I didn't hang up. I knew I needed to hear this. The sound slowly faded, replaced by a voice I hadn't heard before. It was calm, almost soothing, but there was something wrong about it, something inhuman. "They've already started," the voice said. "You can't stop it." I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. What do you want?" The voice ignored my question. "They're not what you think they are. They've been preparing for centuries. Project Epsilon was never about saving you. It was about saving them." I gripped the receiver tighter, my pulse racing. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" The voice chuckled softly, like I'd asked a stupid question. "They've already chosen who will go. The rest, well, you'll see soon enough." The phone clicked, and the line went dead. I stood there, the receiver still pressed to my ear, the cold realization sinking in. This wasn't just about me. Whatever this was, whatever these things were, they weren't just watching me. They were watching everyone. And then, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The gas station was still empty, but I could feel someone, something, standing just out of sight. The shadows in the far corner of the station seemed to move, stretching and twisting in ways that weren't natural. I backed up, nearly stumbling over my own feet. There was no one there, but the air felt thick, like I wasn't alone, like there were eyes everywhere, watching from the dark. I didn't wait. I jumped back in my car and sped off, my mind racing. Whatever those things were, they were real, and they were already here. The government wasn't preparing to evacuate us because of some catastrophe. They were evacuating because we weren't the ones in control anymore. The aliens, the ones that had infiltrated everything, were calling the shots now. And the worst part, we were never supposed to know. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the edge of town. I pulled into a motel, the kind that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, and checked in under a fake name. I didn't care about the grime or the flickering lights. It felt safer than being out in the open. But even there, even in the middle of nowhere, I could still feel them. The shadows watching, the things that weren't supposed to exist, waiting just beyond the edge of reality. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? Because now I knew the truth. I woke up in that dingy motel room, drenched in sweat, feeling more exhausted than when I'd fallen asleep. My head was pounding, and for a second, I thought I heard that high-pitched frequency again, the one that had drilled its way into my skull through the phone. But it faded quickly, leaving behind a deafening silence. Something had changed overnight. The air felt heavier, the world around me off. I couldn't explain it, but there was this feeling deep in my gut that I was running out of time. Whatever was coming, whatever the voice had warned me about, was closing in. I tried to check my phone, but it was still dead. No charging it. No signal. It was like my whole connection to the outside world had been cut off, leaving me completely isolated. I couldn't stay in that motel any longer. I grabbed my backpack and bolted. I didn't have a plan, but I figured anywhere was safer than here. I'd drive until I couldn't anymore, maybe head to the next town and lay low. I thought if I could just stay one step ahead, maybe, just maybe, I could avoid whatever was coming. As I drove, the roads were eerily empty. No cars, no pedestrians, no sign of life anywhere. It felt like the whole world had been hollowed out, like I was the last person left. Even the sky looked wrong, this sickly grayish hue that hung over everything, making the sunlight look pale and weak. I drove for hours, but it didn't matter. Every town I passed through was the same. Silent. Empty. It was like the evacuation had already begun, but no one had told me. Or maybe I wasn't part of it. I kept thinking about what the voice had said. They've already chosen who will go. The rest, well, you'll see soon enough. Was that what this was? Had everyone else already been evacuated, and I was just left behind? Or were they hiding, waiting for whatever nightmare was coming next? The radio crackled to life. I nearly swerved off the road when I heard it, static filling the car for a few seconds before a voice cut through. It wasn't the normal radio host chatter or music. It was a calm, measured voice, speaking with the kind of authority that made my skin crawl. "Attention," the voice said. "The final phase of Project Epsilon has begun. If you are hearing this, you have not been selected. Remain calm. Do not attempt to leave your vehicle." I froze. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "Proceed to the nearest secure location," the voice continued. "Evacuation is complete. You have been left behind for a reason." The static returned, and then the voice was gone. Just like that. Left behind for a reason? I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road, my heart racing. What did that mean? Why was I still here? What reason did they have for leaving people behind? And what did they mean by secure location? There was no one left. No place felt secure anymore. I sat there, staring down the empty stretch of road, feeling completely and utterly alone. And then I noticed something in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a shadow, small, distant, but moving. A figure walking toward me from far down the road, my breath caught in my throat. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I watched, frozen, as the figure got closer, and that's when I realized there was more than one. They were coming from all directions, slow, deliberate steps, like they had all the time in the world. I looked over at the gas station down the road, its broken neon sign flickering in the growing twilight. It wasn't much, but it was the only shelter I could see. Without thinking, I threw the car into drive and sped toward it, my pulse hammering in my ears. I pulled into the lot, tires screeching, and scrambled out of the car, running toward the building. The door was locked, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I kicked it open with a force I didn't know I had, stumbling inside just as the figures reached the edge of the lot. They were closer now, close enough for me to see the details. They weren't human, tall, unnaturally tall, with elongated limbs and hollow black eyes. Their faces were stretched, like someone had pulled their skin too tight over their bones, and their mouths, those smiles, were too wide, filled with rows of needle-thin teeth. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I slammed the door behind me, locking it as if that would actually keep them out, and backed away until I hit the counter. My chest heaved, my mind racing, but I couldn't stop staring at the figures outside. They didn't move fast. They didn't need to. They knew I had nowhere to go. As I pressed my back against the wall, the radio behind the counter crackled to life. That same voice from the car radio. Phase 3 is complete. Integration has begun. I could hear the hum of that strange frequency again, low and steady, like it was vibrating through the very walls of the gas station. My skin prickled as the lights began to flicker. "They are already inside," the voice said. My heart skipped a beat. Inside? I turned to look at the rest of the store, dread creeping through me. The aisles were empty, but something wasn't right. There was a presence there, something I couldn't see but felt. The shadows moved. I blinked, but it wasn't a trick of the light. The shadows in the corners of the store were stretching, crawling along the floor and walls, like ink spilling across paper. They twisted and formed into figures, tall and thin, with those same hollow eyes and wide, empty smiles. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. There was no escape, but my legs moved on instinct, carrying me toward the back of the store. I could hear them behind me, the soft scrape of their footsteps, slow and deliberate. I slammed into the back door, throwing it open, and stumbled out into the cold night air. But I wasn't alone. They were everywhere now, lining the horizon, standing motionless like sentinels, watching, waiting, and then I heard it. That whisper again, from somewhere too close. "You shouldn't have looked." The air around me felt thick, suffocating, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. My vision blurred, my head spinning, as the hum grew louder. I stumbled, falling to my knees, unable to breathe. The world felt like it was unraveling around me, warping and bending, the sky a swirling mass of gray and black. I knew then what it was. I understood. This wasn't about us. This was never about humans. It was about them, the ones who had been here all along, the ones who had waited, infiltrated, and now were taking control. The evacuation wasn't for our benefit. It was for theirs. We weren't leaving Earth. We were being replaced. As I lay there gasping for air, I could see them approaching. The figures, the ones that had been in my dreams, the ones that had followed me, surrounded me. They were here now, their hollow eyes fixed on me. And then, just before the world faded to black, I heard the final whisper. "They're already here."